Welcome to Downshift. My name is Matt and this is the Lexus IS500. Last week we did a tour covering all the most interesting things about this car, and today we've finished our week with the car. So we're going to hit the highlights, the best and the rest, starting with the rest. And at the end we're going to talk about whether or not this is going to make it into my garage full time. Now the first thing when you get behind the wheel of this car is to adjust your performance expectations. Now this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is a very Lexus thing. You need to adjust your expectations before you get into this car. First, if you were expecting an ISF successor to fight the M3 or the C63, you're going to be a little bit disappointed. This IS500 does have 472 horsepower, but with just rear-wheel drive and the archaic 8-speed gearbox, 0 to 60 is done in 4.3 seconds, whereas in the M340i it's like 3.8. You do have adaptive suspension and forged wheels and an LSD, but make no mistake, it's still more on the Lexus side of things than the F side of things. Think of it more as like an IS350F Sport with the V8 swap rather than a true M3 fighter. So that must mean it's an M340i fighter, right? And technically, yeah, price and performance-wise, it is much closer to the M340i, but it's smaller, it's softer, it's slower, and it's older. Which leads me to my second point, and that's age. This car at its core is around a decade old, whereas the C63 is brand new. Granted, it's got half the cylinders and almost a ton on this thing, and the M340i is pretty new as well, and both those cars feel a lot newer than this. The interior is more cramped here, the technology is older or lacking in some cases. I mean, you don't even get a wireless charger in a Lexus here. And ultimately you feel some of that age come through the driving experience as well. However, I'll say it's not all bad. If you like a simple, old school, big power, big sound, and cushy ride, then you'll love this. I think I'll say it this way. This car is objectively and on paper worse than a BMW M340i in pretty much every characteristic. However, I have way more of a smile behind the wheel of this than I ever have behind the wheel of an M340i. Number 3, we're going to talk about the gearbox. Usually I'd lump this into another larger point, but this honestly is the biggest holdup that it's kind of holding me back from buying the car, legitimately. They've got the Aisin 8-speed in here that we drove in the RCF and the recently deceased GSF. And in a vacuum, it's fine, but again, compared to the modern standards, it's not quite as smooth and it's not quite as sharp as the competitors. And for me, the two biggest things that I appreciate in a car and the driving experience are the sound and the shift snap, and that's why I really love the AMGs with their bellowing V8s and their snappy, aggressive 9-speed. I guess what I'm really disappointed in, and we've talked about it with the RCF, is that they have the 10-speed in their parts bin from the LC500, which is so much better, but they continue to use this 8-speed, and it really just kind of hamstrings the car. Number 4 is fuel economy, and this is pretty simple. It's a big 5-liter naturally aspirated V8 making 472 horsepower. It's thirsty. EPA says about 20 mpg, and I've been averaging just above that, but yeah. And number 5, yet another place this car is showing its age, is in the rear seats. It's just a bit cramped. The more modern cars have gotten bigger, but this car has stayed the same size. It's essentially the same size as a new Honda Civic now, which means smaller back seats. You also don't get chargers back here, which is another demonstration of its age. Again, it's not terrible, but it's just not quite on the same par as all of its competitors now. And number 6, we're going to talk about price. And we've harped on this a lot, but for the age of this car, it's a lot of money. Starting, these IS500s cost just under $60,000, but this one as tested is just about $66,000, which makes it almost identical to how I would spec out my ideal M340i from BMW. And that's the biggest problem. The M340i is a better car on paper. It's quicker, it's more modern, it's got better fuel economy, it's all-wheel drive for Wisconsin winters, and it's the same price as the IS500. You really have to love the V8 experience and value simplicity and reliability to go Lexus in this fight. And I do, but we'll talk about that at the end. But with those bases covered, let's talk about some of the best things going on with this IS500. Number one, how could it not be the engine? I love these Lexus 5-liter V8s. They're not the fastest things on the road, but they sound incredible. They make good power, and they've historically been pretty bulletproof for reliability. This engine's cranking out 472 horsepower and 395 pound-feet of torque, technically 1 more horsepower than the flagship LC500, and also 90 more horsepower, at least on paper, than the BMW M340i. Yes, BMW is quicker to 60 thanks to low turbo torque, all-wheel drive grip, and a better 8-speed. But it's the sound character of this engine that gets to me every single time. I don't care if I lose every single drag race as long as I have this for a soundtrack. I would also like to say that this is the best looking car between the M340i, the new C43, and the Audi S4. Now, I would have mine in iridium silver rather than this Grecian blue, but what a color it is anyway. The sparkle here is wild, like a bass fishing boat. It's crazy to think that this car that's been out here since I was in high school, that's had 1 refresh, still manages to look better than anything Germany can do. Some IS500 unique styling bits are things like the raised hood that towers 3 inches higher for all that V8, the 19-inch upgraded BBS forged satin black wheels, which are a brilliant way to spend $2,500 by the way, and the classic stacked exhaust, which this IS500 is the first non-F car to get it. Not even the LC500 with the 5.0 gets the stacked exhaust. 2 years ago, we did a review with the IS350 in that iridium silver with these wheels in this exact parking lot, and I couldn't stop staring at that thing. So now here, with the bulging hood and the quad stack tips, it's got all the drama, it would be the perfect recipe. And number 3, we're talking about the drive as a whole. Now remember at the beginning of the video when I said to adjust your expectations? Well, if you've been able to do that, you can really start to appreciate this car for what it is. The adaptive dampers are soft enough that they don't really beat you up. In fact, they're actually pretty comfortable. The steering is light, but it is responsive. You got good front end on here. The chassis is strong and it's rigid. Doesn't really step out, but that's more of the traction control issue than actual chassis stability. And the braking is good enough for spirited backroad driving, but if you are going to lap it on track, you're going to probably want to upgrade pads and maybe some brake cooling. And then as soon as you roll on power, you have the symphony of V8 and Lexus exhaust sound, which is, let's be honest, something probably the best in the business, or one of. Don't buy this thing if you're looking for an M3. Don't buy this thing if you're looking for the fastest car out there. Don't buy this thing if you go onto the internet and fight with strangers based on horsepower and 0 to 60 times. But if you love to go out for a drive on a lazy Sunday afternoon before a chaotic week begins, yeah, you should buy this thing. So we touched on how kind of dated and familiar this interior has been for the last decade, but it's still really well built. Everything's totally ergonomic, and it's not something that you can always say about the BMW and the Mercedes. Everything is solid in here. Everything feels nice and expensive to the touch, and pretty much everything is physical, except for the climate sliders, but I kind of like those. And nothing creaks or rattles in here. You've got nice luxuries like heated and cooled seats, although I will say the cooled seat icon lights up green and faces the sky, so it's impossible to see during the day. And of course you have a heated steering wheel, and you've got Mark Levinson audio. And you've got a fancy clock on your dash with a carbon fiber weave for the face to remind you of the sportiness. It's certainly Lexus nice in here. I will also say, for something of this age, and I'm sorry that we keep harping on that, but it does have some pretty good tech stuff in here. Your center screen is updated, bigger, and now a touchscreen, so you don't have to use that terrible trackpad. You've got Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, even if it is wired. You've got 360 cameras, and I would use them because the reverse camera is borderline dangerous to use with the warping you get. But you've got one of the coolest gauge clusters ever. It's the slidey one from the original LFA, which is just cool. And then the biggest surprise was the comprehensive driver assist suite. It's got Safety Sense 2.5 or whatever they're calling it, but it's really pretty good, and it does a good job on the highway. It is missing things like a wireless charger, and you get a CD player for some reason, but objectively it's got pretty much everything that I want. And sixth and finally, we'll talk trunk and practicality. The trunk is actually pretty big. It's nice and deep, and the seats fold, although not from the trunk itself. It's a great size, totally practical, and it's fit everything that I've asked it to this week. Final thoughts. So that's the best and the rest of the Lexus IS500. Now, like I mentioned before, this week kind of served as a bit of a test for me in terms of whether or not I wanted to make this my next car. And followers of the channel, you'll know how fond I am of the Lexus LC500. So to capture some of that essence, add the practicality of a bigger trunk and rear seats, and still have that spirit, it's pretty good. So the question that I'm left with now is, am I still considering this for my next car? And I think the biggest problem is the fact that the BMW M340i exists. It's the exact same money, more or less, depending on equipment, and it's faster, it's got all-wheel drive practicality for all seasons here in Wisconsin, but it just doesn't have that V8 soul to it. So I think I need to spend a full week with the M340i before I make a final decision. So I'm sorry that that's the conclusion that we came with, but hopefully that means we'll have an M340i to test for a week, and then we have a decision by the end of the year. So stay tuned, you're not going to want to miss that, and we'll see you in the next one.